Nobody noticed the man when he first walked into the courthouse. His clothes were old and torn, and his shoes barely held together. His hair was messy, and his beard was thick. People stepped away from him like he was something bad. No one asked if he needed help because no one cared. His name was David Collins, but in that room, to them, he was just another poor black man who probably didn't belong there. A couple of officers at the entrance smirked when they saw him. One whispered something to the other, and they both laughed. Even a woman sitting at the front desk gave him a dirty look, like she wanted him out. David walked slowly through the hall with his head down and took a seat in the corner. The room was filled with lawyers, officers, and other officials in neat clothes, polished shoes and expensive watches. They kept staring at him like he was trash. He could feel it, even though no one spoke to him. Soon, the judge arrived. His name was Judge Thomas Baker. He spotted David sitting in the corner and shook his head. He looked annoyed, like the sight of this man ruined his day. The judge made a loud comment to the officers about how the courthouse was starting to look like a shelter. The officers laughed loud enough for David to hear, but David didn't move. He didn't react but just sat there, quiet. More people came in. Some whispered and others laughed quietly. They wondered why this homeless-looking black man was even there. One officer walked over and told him he was sitting in the wrong place and should wait outside, but David calmly said he was supposed to be there. The officer rolled his eyes and walked away. No one cared to ask why he was there. In fact, no one wondered what he might be carrying in that little bag he was holding. No one thought for a second that maybe he was more than what he looked like. They had already made up their minds anyway. The judge kept looking over at David like he was a problem. The officers kept an eye on him, ready to throw him out. Everyone else just tried to ignore him, but David waited, silent, and was watching. And then it happened. The courtroom clerk announced that the court session was about to begin. People settled down, and the judge called for the review officer to step forward. This was the person from the state office who came to evaluate how the court operated, how fair it was, how the officers and judges treated people. Everyone was expecting a tall, clean-cut man in a suit, a person with papers, a briefcase, and maybe a badge. No one expected David. The clerk called out, "David Collins." The room fell silent. Everyone looked around. No one moved. Then David stood up. The room immediately shifted. People stared at him like they couldn't believe it. The officers froze. The judge's face changed fast, from annoyed to pale. David calmly reached into his bag, pulled out his badge, and held it up, and the room went quiet. It was real. David Collins, state official, from the Office of Judicial Reviews. In that very moment, no one said a word. The same people who mocked him, laughed at him, and whispered about him, now they didn't know where to look. The officers who laughed earlier stood stiff with blank faces. The judge, who had just insulted him minutes ago, looked like he swallowed a stone. David walked to the front of the courtroom, placed his papers on the table, and quietly introduced himself. He listed his role, his task, and his authority. He explained that he was there to observe and report how people, especially the vulnerable, were treated inside this very court. The officers lowered their eyes and the judge shifted in his chair while David was talking. What even made it worse for them was that David had heard every word, every insult, every laugh, and every lie told through smirks and fake kindness. And now, the man they thought was beneath them held their future in his hands. David didn't gloat. At least he didn't have to. The silence was enough. The shame hung in the air like thick smoke. He spoke clear and direct, with no wasted words. Names were written down and actions noted. Every person who had mistreated him was now part of his report, and nobody could run. The judge tried to fix it. He stuttered through some words, pretending it was all a mistake, saying they didn't know, that they didn't mean it. He laughed nervously, trying to turn the whole thing into a joke, and the officers nodded along, hoping it would go away, but David didn't smile. He told them this was exactly the kind of behavior his office came to find. The way people in power treated those they thought were beneath them, how quick they were to judge, to mock, and to push aside, how they believed clothes, skin, and money told them everything they needed to know about a person. He spoke of justice not as a word for courtrooms, but as something that should live in how people treat each other when nobody's watching. The room stayed silent. David finished his statement, packed his papers, and left the courtroom the same way he came in, with his small bag, still looking like a man nobody would notice. But now every eye followed him, not with laughter but with shame. His report reached the higher offices. The officers were suspended, and the judge was called in for a hearing. New rules were set in place to check how people were treated inside that courthouse. But for David, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about punishment, but was about showing people who they really were when they thought no one was paying attention. And the people in that room would never forget the day they learned it. Now let me ask you, what would you have done if you were in that courtroom? Would you have laughed too, or would you have stood beside David before knowing who he was? Let us know in the comments. Like this video if it made you feel something, and don't forget to subscribe and share this with someone you care about.